Hello, everyone. My name is Sandra Collins, and I'm the Director of the National Library of Ireland. And it's my great honour to welcome you all this evening to our online event, the fourth in our Living with Pride programme. Living with Pride is a flagship project for the National Library this year. It represents a commitment to diversity and inclusion, and specifically to LGBTI+ equality. We hope that through this project, we can raise awareness of the Irish Queer Archive and the LGBTI+ collections which we care for in the National Library, including the Christopher Robson Photographic collection, the Marriage Equality campaign papers, the Born Digital Marriage Equality Photographic Archive, amongst many, many more. These collections form part of the memory of Ireland, and it's an honour to hold them in trust and to find ways to explore and promote them and to encourage people to engage with them and be inspired by them. There are a number of elements to Living with Pride. Today is the fourth in the Living with Pride year-long programme of events. This programme is co-curated by Tonie Walsh, and it's ambitious and wide-ranging. We're really enjoying and looking forward to the conversations and the reflections that it generates. This month, we launched the Living with Pride exhibition. This is an exhibition of the Christopher Robson Photographic collection, which contains over 2,000 slides, mostly taken at Pride events in Ireland between 1992 and 2007. The collection was donated to us by Christopher's partner, Bill Foley, and Bill worked with the team in the National Library to co-curate the exhibition. The photographs are all fully digitised and available to view in our online catalogue, and the exhibition is in the National Library's Photographic Archive in Temple Bar. It's open 7 days a week from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m, and it's free to visit, and I hope you can find the time to pop in and enjoy it. And if you can't, the exhibition is also fully digitalised and available online, so you can enjoy it at any time from wherever in the world you are. We're also delighted this year to be partnering with Curt International Festival of Literature and to have Sean Hewitt as our first poet in residence at the Irish Queer Archive, where he'll be exploring some of the stories contained in that extensive archive through his poetry. Overall, our approach to developing Living with Pride has been guided by the principle, nothing about us without us. And I'm very grateful to our co-curators and our partners, and to Shout Out, who provided training for our teams. I'm also very grateful to the fabulous team in the National Library who've worked so hard on this project. We also recognise that there's still much more work to do in our diversity and inclusion programme, and that's something that will be continuing over the coming years. But now it's my great pleasure to introduce our co-curator and our chair for this evening, Tonie Walsh. Tonie is a journalist and activist and historian, and he's been at the forefront of LGBT civil rights on the island of Ireland since 1979. He cut his teeth as a journalist at Out magazine, Ireland's first commercial gay periodical, and in 1988 he co-founded GCN magazine. In 1997, he reorganised the archive holdings of the National LGBT Federation into what would later become known as the Irish Queer Archive. And this collection was transferred to state ownership in the National Library of Ireland in 2008. He recently launched a campaign to build an Irish AIDS memorial, and that campaign is currently at community consultation stage with the support of local government and Leinster House. Tonie is currently working on a number of research and writing projects, and we're particularly delighted that he agreed to co-curate this programme of events at the National Library. Thank you, Tonie. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Sandra, for the introduction and for having me. There are times when I can't contain my excitement at the fabulous program that we've scheduled for most of this year to actually run in parallel with the exhibition. So tonight we're going to talk about pride, and for all of you in the room, I want to welcome you. Thank you so much for your company. It means a lot to me and the rest of our panel. You know, you pride. You think about pride. What is it? It means many things to different people. It's very clearly and obviously and historically has been that a protest at unfinished business, a protest at acquiring rights. But on top of that, side by side with that, it's also a family day out. It's a street rave. Sometimes I also think it's the only neutral space you have once a year to actually catch up with your ex-lovers. But it is also, on top of all of those things, it's also a moment where we can actually take stock of the distance we've come. Doing that, we can actually evaluate the struggles we've had. We can remind ourselves, I suppose pride also acts as a type of cautionary tale. It reminds us that sometimes there is unfinished business in every part of the world, no matter how progressive we imagine we are, and we must attend to that. And I think too, also it's a moment, sometimes a poignant moment where we can actually wave goodbye to people who never made it this far. We're still, every year we seem to be faced, no matter how progressive and ambitious in scale pride becomes, I'm talking about the Irish experience, we still actually have to face down people who question its very validity. It's quite extraordinary. People who ask us, why do you need pride? Why isn't there a straight pride? And we've seen some egregious examples of that play out in the last few weeks around Ireland, with some extraordinary homophobic and offensive posters that are even offensive to heterosexuals rearing their head at Waterford Pride, pride flags being torched, casual examples of transphobia and homophobia littering the streets of Dublin. So I think that's, moments like this are a cultural reminder that we actually need to be vigilant. Pride is still very much on our cards, and we need to invest in it. And that's what tonight's excursion is going to actually look at. And with that in mind, I'm really, really, really delighted and honoured to have our three panellists. Eamer Walsh was involved with Foyle Pride Festival, Ireland's longest running non-corporate Pride Festival on the island of Ireland. She was involved from 2014 to 2020. And actually for the latter part of that period, she was Foyle Pride's chair at the age of 22. She's now working with the Rainbow Project, which is providing key health and well-being support to LGBTQ people in the northwest of Ireland. When we were talking earlier on, she remarked that the experience she's had both in the Rainbow Project and her tenure in Foyle Pride have provided her with key experience around working with community organisations and corporate institutions alike, and it's solidified her passion for what she describes as grassroots queer activism as the need for support continues to grow. I'm delighted to have her on board, that she's agreed to actually join us today. Along with her is Eddie McGuinness. Eddie McGuinness was born in Dundalk in 1969 and actually, with great time, experienced his first Pride on the steps of the Central Bank of Ireland in 1993. 28 years ago, 2 years after the government changed the old Victorian British legislation. He's been a choreographer, a director with multiple shows, great musicality. At one point, he both co-contributed to and published a free magazine called Free that was directed at a distinctly younger LGBT audience. We're happy to have the entire print run of Free magazine in the periodicals section of the Irish Career Archive at the National Library in Dublin's Kildare Street. Eddie also wears another hat when he's not actually involved with Dublin Pride. He's now the festival manager of the Dublin Pride team and uses some of that extraordinary bonhomie and exuberance and relentless energy, puts it to the use of the outing, which for any of you who don't know what the outing is, it's Ireland's first LGBT matchmaking festival. You might tell us some more about it later on if we have some time. And it's also yet another opportunity for LGBT people to actually socialise outside of, particularly in the west of Ireland, where support structures aren't as embedded or as prolific as they are in our larger urban centres. Brings me to Margot Slattery, our third person in the panel, who's Global Head of Diversity and Inclusion at IIS World Services. And that role involves her in responsibility for strategic direction, implementation, and alignment of its what they describe as integrated diversity and inclusion initiatives across 5 global dimensions: cultures and ethnicity, abilities, gender, sexual orientation, LGBT+, and generations and age. And we're going to hear more about that later on. She also represents ISS World Services in global diversity and inclusion forums at institutions like the UN Global Impact, UN Free and Equal Initiative, and the Valuable 500 Initiative. During her tenure at Sodexo, she was co-founder and signatory of Ireland's first diversity charter, a very important addition to our conversations around inclusion and diversity, specifically in the workplace. She's won numerous awards, way too many to mention, and I'm delighted that she's actually taken the time to join us for this conversation today. Now, I suppose actually I'll start with you, Margot, okay, and ask you perhaps to fill us in on how you got to the extraordinary enabling place that you find yourselves in today with ISS.
Thank you, Tonie, and really nice to join with you this evening, and lovely to be with everybody else here as well. I guess when you say, how did I get to where I got to now? Probably I would say good luck and probably a dose of charm and being in the right place at the right time. If I'm honest, I think the truth of it is that I'd had a background in business and a passion for activism and for inclusion. And I happened to be in an organization when I was in Sodexo where the opportunity came along for me to get involved in diversity and inclusion. And I did it on a European basis and as part of my day job for quite a while. And then latterly moved into a global role heading up diversity and inclusion. And then just about 2 months ago, I moved to ISS. So it's a relatively new job. And it's a privilege, and I'm very lucky to do it. We've 420,000 employees in the world, and I get to influence and I suppose try to make a difference through what our employees do. So very lucky, and thank you.
I suppose too, you're also really lucky to where you're placed right now. There's been a very distinctive progression in the application of notions of diversity and inclusion, not only in the workplace, but actually how we apply them across the board, and how we how we apply them. And I presume you've seen that play out in quite exciting ways, not just through your role, but some of the conversations that you've been having.
Yeah, I mean, listen, in so many ways, right down to even in the last week, having conversations about the fact that we do business in Poland, we do business in Hungary. I'm challenged by what is happening there. We were talking about what was happening in, the football over the last couple of days. We have these conversations with global clients. And then, it influences, I guess, I have the opportunity to influence and discuss how we who we do business with. Ethics and values come behind that, making sure that our people feel that what we do is in line with their own sense of right and wrong, and helping and supporting in countries. And this is probably the thing that is, for me, the thing that adds most value is, helping and supporting in parts of the world where people can't be out and they can't be themselves. So, today, for instance, we had a webinar and we had our Chinese colleagues on, and a couple of years ago, you'd never been able to do that, but we worked on that very hard to have those colleagues on it. We have to support our colleagues in Singapore and many other parts of the world that couldn't even advertised this was happening today. So again, the privilege is to try to lift the veil at times and have conversations and have uncomfortable conversations, but to make it work. And look, we're very lucky to collaborate with other great organizations to help us to do that as well. And loads of fantastic NGOs and people like you all here tonight who help to make that happen.
You know, what you're describing is some extraordinary forward momentum in the corporate sector and amongst NGOs and statutory bodies in countries where we're lucky enough to allow that to happen. And I want you to hold that thought about forward momentum in the context of how there's been a chipping away of that progressiveness. You just mentioned Poland or Hungary, and I'd love us to possibly return to that in a few minutes. Eddie, so you mentioned that your first Pride Parade was 1993. I mean, how historic is that? Like, and there's a great photograph, of course, of you on the steps of the central bank, as rambunctious as ever. You've been both a witness and a player in the last 28 years. You've been a witness and player to not only some extraordinary change in Irish society, but also the evolution of Pride festivals themselves. Dublin Pride, I always liken Dublin Pride, even though it's located in Dublin, the capital, it is effectively our national pride, in the way that the Dublin Pride, the St. Patrick's Parade in Dublin is effectively the national parade. So you've seen extraordinary changes, and you've been at the coalface of not only developing Dublin Pride into, and especially the parade, into something that becomes is increasingly more of a piece of urban theatre, piece of urban spectacle that everyone can buy into. You've also done all of the hard slog with your peers in Dublin Pride of engaging the corporate sector and engaging statutory bodies. And you know what? It's difficult for people to, when you watch 100,000 people stroll through the streets of Dublin with all of that festivity, it's difficult to imagine a time when the corporate sector simply didn't want to touch Dublin Pride, especially before decriminalisation, and where statutory bodies weren't prepared to actually voice their support. I mean, it's only 2 years ago that the Irish Civil Service actually made a determined and symbolic stand to not only give some real meat to the statutory notions of diversity and inclusion, but actually get out and participate in the parade, along with the Gardaí, along with the Irish Army, yada, yada, yada. We've umpteen examples. It's been quite an extraordinary journey, hasn't it?
It has been an amazing journey right across the board for all of us. But one example for myself is only 2 years ago, in 2019, when the GAA and McGuinness actually came on board and actually walked in Pride Parade itself. Like, that is what you call grassroots. And also remembering that, but also at the same time, individuals like us and others who participate in prides around not only the island of Ireland, we're like little gatekeepers. And we do, in a way, have to call out and not to be afraid. I do it every day around our corporate partners, not to be able to be afraid to say to them, sorry, you're doing that wrong. Example one, the top I'm wearing is from Pennies. And Pennies were doing a range for Pride. And I'm not afraid to say, we called in to their head office and go, sorry, but you have to give something to Pride and not just use the rainbow flag for what it was. That year alone, we called them out that they actually supported Reading Pride, which is their other head office, and Dublin Pride for the first time ever. And now IGLA, the world's organization around lesbian and gay organization, are now getting a percentage of all sales. And that is helping them on the grassroots to actually help activists around the world to do the job that they need to do. I'm a social entrepreneur. We need money in a way to do what we need to do, but also at the same time, you have to have that social inclusion. And that is very important. And right down to the grassroots of community groups. As you know, Tony, in 92, in St. Patrick's Day, the first ever LGBT group paraded in the parade. I was actually part of that grouping, but I was so afraid to be in front of the camera, I stayed behind. Imagine that. And at the same time, we were belted going down the road. After the cameras left us, we were belted with rocks. We were belted with horseshit, and excuse my language, but that was true. And verbal abuse.
I gather, by the way, sorry to jump in there, Eddie. I gather you also pelted with rotten vegetables. 1992.
Yes, completely and absolutely. But then you go 10 years later, as a choreographer of St. Patrick's Day Parade, we actually participated with our first ever troupe, a full team of near 20 dancers, of LGBT members, and we performed our standalone grouping way before New York allowed the gay grouping to be part of their parade. So again, it's different sides of society coming together, but it's using our influences in what our jobs do. And I think using our energy and those influences can get us across the line a lot quicker.
Mm. You know, Gilbert Baker, who designed the rainbow flag, once said to me, I took him on a mini walking tour of Dublin, the National Gallery of Ireland, brought him over, sponsored by Absolute, brought him over for a Pride event, and he presented the gallery with a tiny little rainbow flag. But we ended up having a chat later on about how LGBT people are valued as consumers. And he wanted to sort of puncture some of the preciousness that certain people have about the enduring role of the corporate sector, and especially the overweening involvement of the corporate sector when people can actually just feel it's simply too much. And he said, you know, it's good to remember a day. He talked about the Coors Beers protests, pickets in the United States in the 70s, when gay men and women and trans men and women were refused service. If you were openly trans, gay or lesbian, you were refused service in bars that were owned by Coors. And there was a massive and notorious big campaign boycott of Coors, okay? And it was actually about clearly making a statement about how we should be recognized and valued as consumers. And he made the pithy remark that, you know, there are times when I don't like it, but you know what? When the corporate sector when I'm visible to the corporate sector, it's a form of liberation. And it's the beginning of a type of engagement that's really important. Now, where we take that engagement, of course, is the $1 million question. And I'd like to hear more of your opinion about that later on. Same with Margot. Brings me to Eimear. Listen, you look at Margot and Eddie's experience, and they both represent essentially two sides of the one coin. Eddie coming to Pride from a voluntary-run NGO background and an activist background, and Margot not only with her activism, which she wears very subtly on her shoulders, but also a corporate new. Okay, and then seeing both of those actually coalesce. You've obviously been part of Foil Pride, where you decided that actually you were going to take a different approach to things. And Eddie made a comment about sort of like chasing the money and using funding, especially, by the way, in the absence of statutory funding. I mean, now we take it as a given that we can get money from various government departments, but there was a day when that didn't happen. And there's myriad examples all around the world where people aren't have zero access to statutory funding. And in those cases, they will look to the corporate sector or else look to our own. And there's only so much. I would sort of suggest that there's only so much an LGBT community can do to resource our survival. But I'd really like to hear your take on it and how you've managed to make a really great success of Foil Pride.
Yeah, well, I guess Foil Pride was officially formulated in '93, which was the year before I was born. And so, but it was going like as all prides. I don't know. I wanted to get that in there, but I suppose with all prides, it was growing for a long time. You know? And so in '93, the local activists had kind of been like, let's put a name on this thing, you know, and let's call it what it is. And I think that it was the same, like prides were popping up, taking lead from Dublin, from Belfast, who had maybe come a few years before. Activists had gained momentum, but it was off the back of the services in Derry. And before we were kind of called Foil Pride, Derry Pride, it was Lesbian and Gay Pride Northwest or something like that. It was something very long and not catchy. But I think, and I'm really glad to be here today, because I think what's going to be really interesting is providing like a Northern Irish context, because a lot of the conversations that we have in terms of accessing funding before, a lot of the funding streams now more so compared to maybe a few years ago, we can't access a lot of statutory funding, and I don't think any part of the LGBT sector in Northern Ireland at the moment is funded like a government body, and it's because a lot of the money that comes through at the moment is either peace money or it's money to bring together two communities. And we do that with Pride and with the LGBT kind of meetups and supports that we offer naturally, because it's not often one of the aspects that it's not, we're not bringing people, those communities together on purpose. It just happens by accident. We're bringing together lesbians, we're bringing together trans people, and that just happens by accident. But the money is inaccessible to us because you have to sometimes spin a story in order to be able to access those funds, and so that creates a bit of a barrier for us. And also in the Northwest, historically, money hasn't reached us. Money gets to kind of Belfast and then kind of doesn't travel up the road as much. And so over the past kind of 50 years in the Northwest, what we've ended up doing was just making it ourselves, having collective effort, linking in with the other community groups. So before we had our LGBT sector organisations, we had just people who met up in the back of room of bars and linking in with any youth organisation, or linking in with the students' unions, or linking in with women's organisations, bookstores, to try and get meetings involved, because there was no money, and there still is very little money. And I think as voluntary organisations, I also don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because then when you look at governance, and when look at a group of 7 volunteers who are trying to manage what are we talking in excess? Like, I wouldn't know because we don't deal with big money, but you're looking at it in excess of £100,000, maybe, Eddie, I'm not sure, euro or more. That then, that's big responsibility. It's big pressure for volunteers. It's a big ask. Accountability is massive for Prides as well. Do you know what I mean? So I think that we just knew that, especially with a dairy context in terms of civil rights and in terms of relationships with local organisations, we knew where we were at when we were getting set up in the 90s, and we've always kept that. We've always kept that true, and it's kept us out of trouble. It's kept it manageable, and it's kept it within the community. And so now what we have, our committee members are by and large staff members, client-facing staff members from local community and voluntary organisations, and so that means that these organisations have ownership in the Pride, rather than the kind of companies who would like to come in and sponsor for visibility, rather than being able to then bring service users of different services along with the events and stuff. So I think it's really different, but I think it's quite nice, and there's something really special. Something really special.
I don't doubt that. I don't doubt that at all, and I actually really enjoyed being a participant in Foyle Pride a few years ago. For anyone in the room who doesn't know what Foyle Pride is, it's a combination of Strabane and Derry, London Derry's Pride Festival in Northern Ireland. But listen, you know what? Can I ask you a really bold question? Have you ever considered the engagement of? Has anyone ever talked about wanting to actually grow the festival and realizing that in the absence of statutory funding, the only way to do is to talk to pro-LGBT, LGBT friendly corporate bodies?
Well, I think for one, we're not there yet.
Okay.
So only 3 or 4 years ago. So no, sorry, beg your pardon. 2016, my first year, one of the new committee members had brought on the Pink Mile, and that was working with our local owned and run businesses and doing. I think most Pride programs probably have a Pink Mile now with the map of Derry in the back, and this is where to go and spend your money and socialise and things like that. And it was all local run businesses. But we also linked in with the Rainbow Project when we did that, so that the businesses that were linking in with us were working with the Rainbow Project in terms of getting staff training, insurance, like people's safety. So we weren't telling queer people, here, go to these bars because they gave us £200, but we were saying to them, we can vouch for this place. And that was again, money isn't an option to us because it doesn't cost much to put a festival on in Derry, and especially when you're working in partnership. So we never really feel like we've had a wall in terms of needing money. Because we're completely happy with. Now, that's not to say that if you were to go out onto the streets tomorrow and do a poll, and the LGBT community within Derry who weren't involved in Pride wanted to expand it and have 50,000 people walking down Chipkey Street, and they wanted to take corporate sponsorship, I think then the committee would have to be representative and respectful of that. I think that's fair. But I just think practically we're not there yet. And I don't think that we need to focus on that because it hasn't come up against us. It's not an issue.
Can I say,
what's your
Tonie?
take on this? Yes, go. Eddie, jump in, please.
Yeah, can I take one thing about Pride, and especially here in Dublin, is Pride is one of the biggest times of the year that other LGBT groups have a chance to actually not only pitch to the corporates, but also as a fundraising channel. As you know, from the Rainbow Project, everything like that. Very much so, it allows them a platform that actually showcases what they do. From down here, it's LGBT Ireland, Belong to, Outhouse, Tonie, and so forth, right across the country. And I think that is very, very crucial for prides, especially on the scale of where Dublin Pride is, the likes of Cork Pride and Belfast Pride. In a way, we in a way have to help the smaller prides around Ireland. And we've been doing that part of this year around our community fund, so that everything that goes into the community fund will then be distributed out to all the smaller prides and also LGBT organisations around Ireland. And that means north, south, east and west. So no matter who you are. But on an example is, believe it or not, AXA Insurance, who is one of our key partners for the last good few years, we've worked with them to implement and help them develop their trans policy, their diversity and inclusion policy within their workforce, who then reached out to Tonie, who then actually in return get money to be paid to do their training, and also the likes of Shout Out and others. But also they've reached out and wanting to be partners because, believe it or not, they have a huge workforce in Belfast, in Derry. The call centre is based there. And last year and the year before, we've done webinars with their staff up there, where 20, 30 of their staff who are part of our community all participated, who wanted even more encouragement. So there is an opening all there. And that is where I feel that other organisations and prides, especially in Ireland, the smaller ones around the country, feel that they can actually help and get them proper sponsorship in there. And sponsorship isn't selling out. Sponsorship is allowing you to do the things that you need to do and cost efficient. As you said, Tonie, going forward, that it's only in the last couple of years that our government at both local level and national level is actually funding proper festivals. And that includes the likes of Gays, Gay Theatre Festivals, and also the Outing Festival and others. Yes, the love and passion that there is within our queer culture is very much so can be developed going further.
Thank you. Margot, there's a school of thought that says the increasing involvement of the corporate sector in Pride excludes LGBT voices, community voices. And clearly your experience would suggest that that's not the case.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have kind of mixed feelings about it, Tonie, in the sense that I've been all of my life, well, I suppose just by my own life, I've been involved in the LGBT world, and I've been involved in lots of, organizations who've not had a penny and tried to find their way through and try and make a difference. And like I think Eddie says, I understand when we get some funding, the difference it can make. Having said that, and if you bear with me, I suppose take this to the next stage. I'd also say that for corporates are made up of people. And mostly a lot of the people who get up and go to Pride are people who are either allies or they're LGBTQ plus people themselves. And one of the big reasons that corporates do that is because they want to celebrate the people in their Pride or in their network, just like they do for everybody else. However, what I'm probably not so keen on is that sort of pink washing when, you do nothing else all year and you think we just throw money at the problem, put a float out or put some people on Pride. So that's where I have a kind of a bit of a love-hate sort of reaction with it. But if I'm honest with you, when I've been at Pride for the last couple of Prides that I've been at, and particularly after marriage equality, when you go and see the companies, what I saw mostly was companies who stood up and were there around marriage equality, who supported the movement, who supported their own people, who, had the integrity from their own people to have been behind the kind of movement and change we had. And then I saw them going to Pride. It felt right that they should be there and they should have a chance to be there and to express this and to celebrate. And, going back to what you said in the beginning, Tonie, people absolutely love it. It's a day, it's a big family day. It means so much to people. So, I don't want to deny people either. So I think as long as it's not a company who, totally abandons everything the rest of the time and then just hops on the day, I'm comfortable with that. I mean, if it's consistent and it's an organization who's seeing this as supporting their people, then for me, that's absolutely fair.
Good point. And you know what? I suppose it's salutary to remind ourselves sometimes that globally, social inclusion and diversity policies have in the main been driven by large corporates
Absolutely.
that had all of the resources at their disposal and the luxury, essentially, to indulge the conversations that were necessary and put in place the reforms that flowed from those conversations. You're hitting on something when you were chatting there. It struck me that we need to talk about how we make pride sustainable. Because I also think too, people have their own valid criticisms, and it's impossible, like anything, when you're actually trying to appeal to an enormous demographic. It's for another reason why I hate the term. I don't hate it. I'm not too happy on the term LGBTI community, because I actually think there are many communities. But I'd rather liken our sexual and gender minorities to a rainbow society. It's not some monolithic demographic. And when we actually take some time to recognize that it is not monolithic, sometimes there are very competing needs mm-hmm. in terms of visibility, competing needs in terms of the messaging that we make and everything else, and our enduring engagement with society. So I'd like to ask the three of you in your own way to sort of share some thoughts on how we make Pride sustainable. And how we also literally sustain it throughout the year as well. So it isn't just this once a year moment where we tick all the boxes and that's it, you're done. And by the way, I'm not just referring to responsibilities of corporate sector here. I'm talking about everybody. That it has to be. I know that the three of you have some interesting takes on this. It can't just simply once a year. Perhaps let's start with you, Eimear. And then Margot and Eddie, just jump in when you feel you want to. Eimear, yes, sustainability and all that.
Yes, I think so. I obviously haven't got a foil Pride hat on, and I haven't for a year and a half, 2 years almost. But I've got a Rainbow Project hat on. And I think in terms, so it's given me a lot of context. I want to make clear and in different context, and it challenged a lot of my values. Whenever I took on the role, and a lot of the work, like we do Diversity Champions program, which is something similar to what Eddie was talking about with the engagement with corporates and making sure that it's responsible engagement and all that kind of stuff. And that's something that we do in partnership with Stonewall. And I think that things like that, in terms of the work that you are doing in Dublin Pride, Eddie, in terms of the work that Rainbow were doing with Stonewall and the Diversity Champions, ensuring that the money is flowing through the LGBT sector in responsible and clean, good ways. Do you know what I mean? And making sure that we are engaging with the LGBT staff networks, but also the people who they work with, and making sure that their work environments are safe and accessible, and that they feel valued in work. Because, the LGBT community, and all I have is stats for Northern Ireland, where higher drug and alcohol use prevalence, where higher mental health. I don't need to say all that. We all know that. I'm just coming from a kind of service provision background now rather than an organisational background. But I think in terms of sustainability, you need the visibility, but you also need it to be accessible in terms of Pride. And so a key issue that I've kind of found from stepping back and being more working with the groups and with service users is that, and it was really disheartening to me actually, because I had learned a lot more about Pride since I had left Foil Pride than I kind of did whenever I was there, was that some Prides can be really inaccessible for small community organisations, even big community organisations like Rainbow, in terms of the level of engagement for community sector and then the corporate sector. And so what we found was the costs that incurred in terms of taking ads out for our own programming in kind of drug and alcohol free zones, which was obviously what we do with health and wellbeing. The costs incurred for us to be able to take out those ads was astronomical. We couldn't afford it. We could only afford to put in a group of, whatever the brackets were, 10 or 20 walkers for the parades. And that's in the north just, and the bigger northern prides. We couldn't afford like the band for the music. We couldn't afford the music. We were bringing the music on the handheld speakers. And so that gave us, like we were there and they tried to engage. We were there and we were present. But then, like, you've got a bank coming with a massive pink hippo because they can pump loads of money into it. And it's disheartening, when maybe that's pinkwashing and maybe I'm picking it up wrong, but that hasn't changed. That aspect hasn't changed. And I think that in terms of what Pride is for me, it's about sustaining and nurturing the LGBT sector and boosting the profile of the LGBT sector and the support services, because Pride was born out of trying to help LGBT people and further the rights. And so the sector should be the people, the queer young people in the groups, the service users, the people who have been through the council and with our services and belong to and project should be the ones at the front of the parades automatically, no cost, no expectation. Bring your banner, bring whatever sign you want, and no pressure. But unfortunately, that's not the case, and I do understand the costs need to be fair, but I just found that it was inaccessible. So for me, that's not sustainable. If that answers your question in a very long way.
Yeah, no, great. Margot, you just had your hand up there a second. Come to you in a moment, Eddie. Go for it.
I think, so many things. Look, I don't disagree, on the points made, but I think, when we talk about sustainability, we have to think about evolution, and everything in life involves, Nokia made mobile phones one time, they were gone, and now it's Apple and they'll go and something else, and life changes. And, when you're involved in an NGO or an organization, and when you see something fall down because there isn't funding, that's also very tragic. And I was a co-chair of Glenn at the end of Glenn's life. And I have to tell you, when everybody pulled the rug and we had no money and no funding and we couldn't continue to do what we were doing, we fell down, and the Republic of Ireland, as far as I'm concerned, and the nation of Ireland lost a very valuable service. So as an NGO or as an organization who's supporting, you need that balance. You need sustainable long-term input. I certainly don't believe that it should be, that a capitalist perspective should lead the way. It should be the way that sort of, the determination of the strategy is led, but it needs to fund and come behind. So it's like anything in leadership, you come behind, you support, you hold people up. And I go back to the point that the people who are in corporates, and for instance, that, I support in what we do, and the thousands of people in my organization and many other organizations who are involved in the Pride part and who ask their organizations to fund it, are the people who are LGBT. They are our rainbow community. It is their lives. It's representing their lives. On so many fronts, it's really important for them as well, because they go to work, and if they start separating work and the rest of their lives, then we're going back to something, the sin of Ireland was to reveal. And we need to think about that. The moment is to be revealed now, and to be free. And I think it's incredibly important. But I think the balance is right, and I certainly never would want that the activists, the organizations are doing so much on the ground, are suppressed or at the back of the parade. It's about those, and we celebrate those, but it's also supporting and coming behind. So just a few points, and I'm sure, Eddie, you've got loads you want to add to that.
Yeah, and Eddie, we're talking. What Margot's really talking about here is designing a more sophisticated tone to the conversations all of the various stakeholders of Pride are having. That's really what it comes down to when you strip everything away, isn't it? Really, your story about AXA here is a perfect example of that, in terms of emboldening inclusion strategies from the conversations that you have. Those conversations would never have happened if you hadn't had the platforms in place at the outset.
I think going forward, one thing that we all agree going forward is we're never going to agree on a format. But as individuals like ourselves, and especially within my role with Colour with Pride, in 2019 and in a way 2018, we listened to a lot of our community in a way give out that it was too corporate. So what we did was flip the whole parade itself and taking your element of what Foil Pride is, which I absolutely love, that no corporates were there, but also on the basis is we put the communities first. But we got all our corporates, and a percentage of the corporate money paid for banners, T-shirts, balloons, everything else, and their own, in a way, floats that they wanted. We offered, we'll get a float made for you. We'll get your music system made for you. And that's what we did. We'd actually made a percentage of that money available to each one of the corporates going forward. But taking lead, and we nearly in a way took lead from the likes of Google, who years previous, for a couple of years, believe it or not, paid for shout-outs float for 3 years, part of Pride, and did a big, massive deliverance of that. But also on the basis of the likes of Belong To, everything like that. And also sometimes we have to tear it back. And in 2019, we decided to go on a more eco-friendly, to try and say less floats and more people. And by doing so, it allowed everyone to kind of pare everything back, but still to be very much a visual element, and take my creative end of things of what we did in St. Patrick's Day. In the early days, St. Patrick's Day was all the tractors. It was always the corporates going down the road. But then St. Patrick's Day decided to flip it and make it more about the tales of what Ireland is all about. And I think that's what we're trying to get in with for Pride as well. But one of the elements going forward is, and I think we started the Outing Festival over 9 years ago, and every smaller Pride, the back of my car was full of rainbow flags on poles pre-done. The rainbow flag came with me, but also a sound system to help the smaller prides. And I remember doing Sligo Pride, what's called now Mayo Pride, what's called Galway Pride, Limerick Pride. I can start naming them all off. But if you talk in 2018, 2019, and even 17, we came with pre-made signs with equality, what you call it, all those symbols that in a way they couldn't actually allow or afford to do for their stage. But we came ready-made with all that material in the back of a van and went, here you go, here's a ready-made stage for you. Gave us a couple hours to do that. But then that is from the top down, helping the smaller prides. And I think one thing about prides is not to just have it on one day a year. It is 365 days a year. And we're lucky here in Ireland that it is.
Yep. If you're having it 360 days a year, that presumes you're having the necessary conversations. And, you know, we've just come through some of the most dystopian times ever. We're not quite out of it. The pandemic has really writ large some of the inequalities, the infrastructural qualities within our diverse community in terms of mental health. One of you mentioned mental health earlier on. In terms of mental health, specific set of sociocultural and some needs that are part of our community. And I'm just curious to know how we can use Pride festivals to, I suppose, ramp up some of the conversations that pivot on, that remind us of our duty of care to each other. That remind us of, as which is of course is the theme of our talk, that unfinished business. That remind us how we can actually hone in on people who, you know, just aren't getting as much as they should be from Pride, because they've been lonely, or because they're still not out, or whatever, or they're facing harassment in the bullying in the workplace, or whatever. So I'd like to, the three of you, please, give me your take on what it's been like during the pandemic, and also how we can use the platforms we have to push on those conversations that are so necessary.
Can I start with a small point, as you said, Tony, is the first thing when COVID in a way came into play is Dublin City Council reached out to Dublin Pride because they were worried about our older LGBT members. And one of our initiatives over the last couple of years was older than Pride. It was, in a way, we were saying anyone over 50, we're not forgetting about you on the anniversary of what Pride was, 50th anniversary. But from that is we reached out, and within a very window of time, for 6 months, I was doing shopping on average 3-4 times a day for our LGBT members that I never even had known, but at times met some of them that I had met 20 years ago who are now even older and actually have ailments and have actually gone, in a way, back into the closet because they can't communicate to their social care worker. They can't communicate to their home help, or even when they're in actually homes, in a way, they go backwards into the closet because they can't be themselves, especially for our trans families and also those with other intellectual difficulties.
The other thing, too, is I imagine, Margot, yeah, please.
No, Tonie, I didn't want to talk over you, but
yeah, well, you're also Eddie, you're also hitting on notions of governance here. Eamer mentioned it earlier on. Duty of care too has to be encoded in governance, whether it's the Articles of Association and governance of a voluntary-run NGO or a corporate body. You spell it out. Again, you can't just throw the words diversity and inclusion and integration around, because we'd all end up being frauds if we don't actually get to work, ask ourselves, well, what are they and how do I make them real? Margot.
Yeah, and I think actually that's a very good point, is governance. And, I think we have to question the governance of organizations that don't, that you bring the point up, Eddie, around, for instance, older people and certainly people who end up in care. And we see organizations who are providing that care and saying that they recognize the dignity of people, but then they do not recognize most definitely the dignity of people who are trans. I had the experience a number of years ago before my mother died and she was in a nursing home. My mom had Parkinson's. There was a trans woman in her nursing home who reverted back 20 and 30 years and did not get the care and was not recognized, and her name was not used. And it was a very, very difficult situation. So going backwards, Tonie, when you asked us about, what are the ongoing conversations, what are the things that are coming up, that's a definite conversation that's happening in workplaces. How do we as organizations help people to age in our organizations, to think about what their rights are, what their benefits are? I mean, one of the big things that has happened in the corporate world, and remember, corporates are not all big companies, and I want to kind of push that one out there as well. You've quite often got small SMEs who are supporting things. It's not all big banks, and money and the formats and the sizes can be very different. But one of the big things I think workplace has done is help to improve the benefits for people. Particularly, if you're the partner of someone who is having benefits or has a pension plan or any of those things, that's been a big, I think, convener of change. Also, workplace has been able to call out some of the big wrongs in the world. I'm not saying it's a panacea, but if you look at, for instance, what organizations like PayPal did in the south of America when they wanted to, they wanted to put up a factory or a place where, for instance, the government, was rolling out and was taking away our rights. When you look at what is happening today, even in, it's slightly different, but you look at what happened in the EU with the Chancellor and various people coming and business getting behind that, I think it can be a convener of very interesting conversations. And certainly one of the conversations we've been having over the last while is really around trans rights, particularly because we see in the UK there's a big backlash against trans people and our trans family. And we've been trying to really raise it up and say, we don't stand by this and we stand up for doing the right thing. And maybe just the last point, I think, again, I'm not the defender here of every corporate, but certainly things I know to be true is that some of the organizations I've worked with have walked away when they have been challenged on their stance on marriage equality. They've walked away from business. They've walked away from suppliers. I certainly know that Sodexo that I worked with had a scenario where a Christian rights group in the US didn't want them to continue because of their stance on marriage equality, and they walked away, and it cost them a lot of money to do that. So I think there's a lot of fundamentals there that have come around, and lots of the big social change have come around through that. But again, nothing's perfect, and there are,
Sure.
it's not entirely black and white.
And the other thing too is when you talk about corporates, I mean, corporates don't have a gender, but in passing, it's good for all of us to remind ourselves that actually there are gay businesses that also need, gay and lesbian businesses that need to be called to account. And I can give you many examples, like stretching back to when we founded GCN in '87, where some gay business, given the culture of shame and criminality that exists in Ireland at the time, there were some gay businesses that were happy to take your punts, but didn't want to actually take an ad out in GCN magazine.
Yep.
You know?
Yep.
We've got a lovely question from the audience that I'd like to address firstly at Eamer. It's from Mel Duffy. And now I'm realizing we've got 5 minutes notionally from the end. So maybe this is the point for anyone in the audience to actually throw some questions at our panel. But Mel Duffy has made a really good observation about how much is the notion of proper, presentable, queer, the need to unpack that. The fact that marriage equality presented to the public that queers were folks like straights. Have we actually lost our diversity? Have we actually lost our queer agency? And given that you've been at the helm of Foil Pride, which is all about really, really maintaining that very specific notion of queer identity that you have in Strabane and Derry. Maybe you'd like to be the first person to answer that question, Eimear?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. I think whenever the marriage equality stuff was happening both north and south, it was very conflicting for maybe a lot of us because it was very polished and it was for a very specific set and group set of queers. And a group set that I don't fall into, that a lot of my family and friends don't fall into. So even though we should have seen ourselves in a lot of that movement, we perhaps didn't until, I was then involved in it and it changed. But it was not, for a lot of people, it was a narrative, wasn't it? And but as Margot has raised about the trans healthcare issues and other things, I was kind of thinking at the time, there are more pressing things happening right now that need some attention, need some funds, need some platform. I am losing the ability to speak as close to dinner time. So I think that's a great question. I think definitely it was put across as very polished and definitely the kind of straight passing. That's like a term that we're kind of using now more and more so. It was for more straight passing people. Did it do more harm than good? No, I don't think so. Legislation is good, and we're working through it now here in the north as well. And we're delighted to see it. But it was a hurdle that we got over, and we are like straight back in. Like with Rainbow Project, we're straight back into the next one. It was good it's a long time. It was a long time. It was about better resources. With Pride, we never maybe fully embraced it in Foil Pride because, again, committee members in Foil Pride were also spending most of the time delivering food parcels and doing the sexual health testing and doing that on the ground work. And so we were kind of thinking, people are in crisis here. People are having actual mental health crises, and we're doing referrals to X, Y, and Z all the time. That's somebody else's responsibility to run forward. But now as a Rainbow Project employee, I can see how it benefits. I have a wider view of it, But at the time in Foil Pride, definitely, we were more interested in the dirty, nitty-gritty, less fashionable stuff. And I think still probably are.
Hipsters to the very end. Listen, while you have the floor, one of our audience has also asked about your thoughts on the police participating in Pride. And of course, Foil Pride is quite specific in how it deals with police presentation. Will you actually talk to us about that?
Of course. So again, I just want to make clear, I'm no longer on board with Foil Pride. So the current committee now will obviously work with the community for their own views. But whenever I was involved for that 5 years or whatever, and from '93, we had a kind of blanket ban, both on statutory and corporate sponsors and engagement. So that included the likes of police and all the rest. I think that would have included the police anyway because of history. So you have to look again at the context. It's very different up here. It's very different in Derry specifically, let alone Northern Ireland. And like when you look at the queer community, all we want to do is be safe. And I think for a lot of people, it wouldn't have stayed well for us to make that move. And that was made clear to me in my last year or second last year. Well, there was a huge backlash for example, there was LGBT PSNI Land Rovers coming up the Glenshane Pass from Belfast to Derry, that's that road. We didn't know where they were going. And we had taken a lot of slack from a lot of local activists who actually hadn't engaged with Pride before, which was really annoying, because if there had been a conversation there, we could have cleared it up. It became a bit of a mess in that we had been in cahoots was the kind of wording and the way that it was being sold. And I was trying to be like, Jesus, lads, they're on the Glenshane. Like, they're not driving it on the parade. They're on the Glenshane the week off. You know, it wasn't like that. But it was because people, it can be really harmful for people. It can be really triggering for people. And we understand that. And so we just say it's for us right now in terms of safety, in terms of the well-being of our community, and in terms, like, we couldn't do it without them. They closed the roads for the parade. You know, we have to engage with them and get the SAG sign off. But in terms of that engagement, we work with the Gay Police Association and like as an LGBT group, and that is the height of it.
Sure. Eddie, there's a really good question from Fionn Kidney, who asks, are corporations, even the ones very engaged with Pride, ready to use the term queer? And I'd also, by the way, love to hear your take on this after Eddie, Margot. Are corporations, even the ones very engaged with Pride, ready to use the term queer in place of the likes of LGBTQIA, as it comes into more common usage as an umbrella term? He asks the question, do they understand it? Do we as a group of communities understand it? Super question, Fionn. Thank you. Eddie, your take.
Excellent question, because on the basis is, even as ourselves, we have to educate ourselves what the word queer means. And going forward, that passion, what queer means, very alternative. And I'm not afraid to call myself a queer activist or a queer dancer choreographer. Within that mind, yes, I actually see a lot of key corporates, and especially going back, the smaller SME companies that are out there who can in a way educate themselves easier. But one of our workshops is part of Pride at Work. We actually talk about the terminology and the diversity within our own terminology, what the different flags, which are behind me, all mean, but also at the same time, what the different words mean. And we actually produced a book, an ally's guide to Pride, with Shout Out. But that's two organizations coming together and looking at all the different terminology. And when I sat and read it, I was going, I actually didn't know that. Thank you. And that is the crucial thing.
In your conversations with recent corporates, you talk about the SMEs, the recent corporations where you've used that word. Do you get a sense that they understand it, as Fionn asks? Do you get a sense that they understand what the term means, especially since queer starts to gain currency as a descriptor really from the mid-90s onwards, as a positive descriptor, and it's continued its relentless application for better or worse since then. Many generations of older lesbians and gay bi men and women have problems with that word. But do some of those not only corporates but other stakeholders in Pride actually, do they get the term? Do they get what it means in terms of its cultural applications? And also, are they comfortable using it?
Like some are not, and I'm not sugarcoating it. Some are definitely not comfortable. Even within government, the LGBTI strategy was put in place, and they took the word Q out because some, even in our own community, organizations said, no, don't use the word queer, because you might offend both our older generation who find queer offensive because that's what they were called constantly throughout their life, but also at the same time going forward, whereas our younger generation actually have grabbed the bull by the horns and said, yes, we are queer, we're alternative, and we don't give a damn. And we're definitely not going shopping in any sort of format. So that is the crucial thing. And I think it's also individuals like ourselves and the next generation coming up is really taking it by the horns and going, yes, the queer has to be used and actually needs to be used very foremost.
Margot, have you ever seen any pushback against it in your circles?
So, yeah, I have, and I'd be honest and say that I think, we have to take time and we have to take people on a journey with that language, because exactly what Eddie's just said, I've certainly had people who, particularly older folk in our organizations, who've said, they've had really very difficult situations, are very triggered by it, and for them it's very difficult, and you can't certainly just change it overnight for them in how we address it. But what I have seen is that we're incorporating, mostly organizations, love it or hate it, are now saying LGBTQ plus. I think we're gently introducing the language. We're obviously saying, if that's the language you want to use and you're comfortable with it, that's fine. But there are also a group who are less so. We're trying to find balance around it. Some organizations are probably moving quicker there and some slower. But, when you do a job like I do, you have to respect everyone's perspective and try to to listen and hear. So for me, that's going to take time. And maybe just one last one, going back to the question, I suppose, about, the activists and the people who were in the beginning of Pride. I would hate that we lost that, and I would hate that we lost the kind of, I suppose, the creativity, the originality, the authenticity of people who have been such a big part of it. And I don't want it to be all glossy and slick. I'm not that myself. It's got to be what it's about. And we're a lovely mixed bunch of such different creative people and that's what's attractive about it. So we don't want to do the Oscar, what's the Oscar Wilde quote, every man kills the thing he loves. Well, we don't want to kill the thing we love. That's what we love about it, and bring it on, and let's have it with all of its beauty.
Well said. And you know what? Just to finish, I was going to ask each of you what Pride means to you, but you've described it so eloquently and beautifully. Do you have anything to add to that? What Pride means to you?
No, just rock on. I think, I love that it's there, and I would be brokenhearted if we didn't have it. My mother-in-law, just tell you this quick one. She keeps saying, why do we have Pride? Because she thinks everything is and I keep saying, well, Brenda, why are you in the ICA? It's something I get involved in every year. Like, you go to the ICA, it doesn't stop.
Lovely. Eddie, what does Pride mean to you in a couple of sentences?
Very quickly, is Pride means to me, in a way, the inner child and the inner gay boy when younger, who wanted to dress up, who couldn't get dressed up, is allowed to actually dress up. And as a 52-year-old man, I'm still allowed to run around the streets in a sequins rainbow jacket and go, hello, jazz hands, and be myself. But also, as you say, meet all your ex-lovers and say hello again to them, which is always a good place to say, because even the ones that didn't like you in the end actually say and smile and say hi to you.
Gorgeous. Thank you for that. Eimear, to finish, what does Pride mean to you?
It's a big question. I tried to think about it after our talk earlier. But I think ultimately I see it as a platform, but I see it as an opportunity, as you say, to bring ex-lovers together. I see it as just like people who I really haven't seen over the year, people who haven't got the opportunity to see each other for a year. It's connection, isn't it? It's connection, it's community, it's linking up. It's the week beforehand of all the events and running to and fro and having the debrief pints and whatever afterwards, and trying to get over the stress of it all. And it's that opportunity to have the space in your town and the reclaiming of your own streets. Being able to walk down Chipkey Street. Like, I've got 2 photos here. This is Pride in '93 in Derry, and it's a group of about 20 trade unionists, and there's only about 3 people watching. And then this is 2013, and you can't really tell, but it's completely different. And I always think, as you said, Eddie, if I was a young person, I was looking at this one, and if I was looking at this one, which would I feel more valued looking at? And I think that Pride has to be something that encapsulates that, and that can grow, that people look at it and they think, Jesus, that's class. I want to be in that next year. I want to be in that samba band at the front next year.
Gorgeous. I'm going to leave it at that because I'm really conscious of the time. But this thought that Pride is classy, I want to be at that. Let's keep that uppermost in our minds. Listen, I'm looking at all of you in the room, and I just want to thank you for your participation tonight. As at one of our Living with Pride cultural events. They continue for the rest of the year up until World AIDS Day. Please check nli.ie for more information. Just remains for me to actually thank our fabulous panelists, Eddie McGuinness, Margot Slattery, Eamer Walsh. Okay. Happy Pride, everyone.